Greetings quilters! Welcome to the latest quilting classroom brought to you by AccuQuilt and Create and Craft TV. I'm Stuart Hillard and I'm going to be your teacher today. If you're not already subscribing to our AccuQuilt classroom videos, make sure you subscribe and then you won't miss a single new free pattern and lesson. Now today we're going to be looking at the AccuQuilt Angles Companion. We've looked at the cube in the past, and if you've just got your cube or about to get one, our very first video was on the cube. You're going to need that cube, but this show today is all about the Angles Companion, which is an add-on. It's a bolt-on additional pack of 4 brand new shapes that are going to expand the possibilities for your quilt making. I've been quilting for many years, and as soon as I got my hands on the Angles Companion, it just exploded the possibilities of quilts and quilt blocks that I was able to make. For example, this quilt right here. Now this is my winter mystery quilt, which has just been published in a national magazine, and this uses the cube and the Angles Companion. Now you can probably recognise lots of the shapes already from your cube. We've got things like the large square and the small half square triangle. We've got square on point, and we've got things like small squares forming the chain. So some good basic shapes there, but what makes this design really exciting are those slightly more unusual shapes. Now, confession time, as a quilter and a quilt designer, I've avoided those shapes for years and years because they're difficult to rotary cut, and I am not a person who likes to use templates. I never have. But as soon as I got hold of the Angles Companion, suddenly triangles in a square was a possibility. Half rectangle triangles were easy. Kite shapes were as easy to cut out as a square or a strip. So having these dies in my toolbox really expanded the possibilities, and there are so many fantastic traditional and modern quilt blocks that you can make using those dies. So within this quilt I've only used the cube and the Angles Companion, so all sorts of possibilities. Let's have a look at this quilt now over here. Now this quilt is my Christmas cactus quilt, and you can see here very clearly those half rectangle triangles. These have real impact in this quilt, and I've combined them with simple rectangles and squares to create the majority of the quilt. The other shape that's really important in this quilt is this shape right here that forms a diagonal frame around that center block. And this is the trapezoid shape. This is also included in your Angles Companion. Now, in today's lesson, I'm going to be showing you how to make this quilt block, which is based on the traditional 5440 or fight quilt block, and we'll be talking a little bit about the history of that quilt block too, and how easy it is to piece this using your Angles Companion. So get ready for a great lesson, grab your fabrics. You're going to need that Angles Companion, so let's have a little unbox of that and see what we've got in here. Now you might have noticed that I've got the brand new 10-inch cube here. Now it's not released in the UK yet, but I have my copy and I couldn't wait to use it. Just like all of the other cubes, it gives you those 8 brilliant essential shapes: squares, half square triangles, rectangles, parallelograms, square on point, and quarter square triangles. So that's our 10-inch cube. Right here I've got my companion angles, and that's what's really important today. So let's unbox. So you can see in here we've got those 4 great dies, and I'm going to unpack them right here. You've also got your cutting mat. which is all important, and you've also got your DVD on how to use the system. So if you're brand new to AccuQuilting, you've got that DVD to support you. But let's have a look at the shapes that we've got. So first of all, we've got shape number 13, which is the triangle in a square centre. Looks a bit like a pyramid, I think. Great shape to use on its own. So we could use this one up, one down, one up, one down in a border, would be fantastic. We can piece two together, one on top of the other, to create a diamond. But I'm going to show you all kinds of ways to use it today. Die number 14 is our half rectangle triangle. Now, such a simple shape to piece, but really awkward, I think, to cut. You've got two here on the die board. So we've got a centre blade right here. And notice as well that all our dies cut off the dog ears. So no need to go in there with a pair of scissors and trim those off. So that's 13 and 14. Then we've also got dies 15 and 16. Now die 15 is that kite shape. Now this works brilliantly, in particular with die number 14, the half rectangle triangle. Many different quilts that you can create using that. And then finally, we have got die number 16, which is this one right here. And this is our trapezoid. Looks a little bit like a roof on a house. And this is what I use to create the diagonals in my Christmas cactus quilt. So 4 great shapes. Don't forget to check out on our website, we've created 72 original quilt blocks combining your Angles Companion with your cube. So plenty of possibilities there. But as I say, in today's lesson, I'm going to teach you how to make my modified 5440 or fight block. So let's get started. So we're going to be making a modified 5440 or fight quilt block today, and I'm just going to show you my little wall hanging that I've made using that block. Now the 5440 or fight quilt block forms the very centre of this block, so you can see a red and tan chain that goes diagonally through from corner to corner, and also blue, like a blue spiky star in the centre. So that in itself is the 5440 or fight block, named after a boundary dispute in North America in the 1840s. Eventually the boundary was settled at latitude 5440, but the rallying cry amongst local people at the time to defend the boundary was 5440 or fight, and it was commemorated in this quilt block. Great favourite amongst quilters, and looks fantastic done either in traditional colours as I have, or in really bright modern fabrics. It would also look great, and it's also a quilt block that looks fantastic done on point. It almost has a sort of firecracker or firework look when it's tilted on point. So I'm going to leave my block there, and let's grab our dies that we're going to need to make this block. First of all, let's talk about the dies that you're going to need from your cube. So we're going to need die number 2, that's our small square, and I'm going to use this one for that diagonal chain. We're also going to use it out in the border, but we'll get to that in a little while. So we need die number 2, and we're going to cut some squares. I'm going to cut mine in red and tan. I've already got my strips pre-cut. When you come to cut strips, if you can cut them from selvage to selvage, when you lay your fabric on top of your die, try and make sure that the selvage is running either on the left or the right of your die, and that will ensure that the lengthwise grain is going through your machine. Now we need 8 of these squares per block, and I can cut 6 at a time. So I can still leave the rest of my fabric attached. There's plenty of space underneath your AccuQuilt cutter. So we'll wind that through. And that's 6 squares cut. and then I just need 2 more. So just move your strip along and recut 2 more squares. So that's all our red squares cut. Now I need to do exactly the same with my tan fabrics. You could use cream, you could use white, you could use black or navy, anything really that's going to be a good neutral background fabric. So just fan fold your fabric back and forth up to 6 layers and cut, and then we'll just shift that fabric along and cut 2 more, and that's all our small squares cut out using die number 2. So I'm just going to put those together in a little stack, and I'll come back to those in a short while. So that's die number 2 done with for now. Now the next thing that we need to do is to cut that center square on the block. I'm going to use die number 1 for this center square. But if you've already been using your AccuQuilt for a while, you will probably already be looking at that center square and thinking of what you could replace it with. So for example, we could replace this center square with another 4 square number 2 and create a checkerboard in the center as well. We could also have a diamond in a square, so use die number 5, which is your small half square triangle, and 6, which is your square on point, and that would create a square on point in the center. So there are various different possibilities. We could even use that background square as maybe a space for a plique, but I'm going to use die number 1, which is my large square die, which I have hiding here somewhere. Right on the bottom, there it is. So we're going to cut one of those again in red. So again, we'll grab a piece of fabric and we'll run that through. And again, there's no need necessarily to cut your fabrics down when you're doing this. So long as your fabric doesn't get caught on the edge of the machine as it's going through, you can leave the rest of your fabric intact, and that way it really helps to minimize any wastage when you're cutting. So there's my large center square, and my fabric's ready now for use later on. So I've got my large center square all cut out. So that's die number 1 finished with, so I can pop that one away. Now then, we need to grab some dies from our Angles Companion, and we need 2 dies in particular. We're going to be using dies 13 and 14. Now die number 13, remember, is that triangle in a square center. Okay, and we're going to need 4 of these, and we're going to cut these out of tan. Okay, just a light tan fabric, and they're going to create this shape right here. Okay, so I've got my piece of fabric all cut ready. I've got my 4 layers. Just lay it over the top of your shape. Use your 10 by 10 cutting mat. Now if you've got the 6, the 8 or the 9-inch cube or the 12-inch cube, you can still make this block, of course. You're just going to have a different size block when it's made. I mean, look how easy it is to cut out that shape. 4 layers of fabric, it's all done. All my dog ears are clipped off, and that's done and dusted. Last thing I need at this stage are some half rectangle triangles. So this is using die number 14. Now I'm going to need 8 of these, and my die cuts out 2 at a time. So I need 4 layers of fabric. Lay that over the top, and just so long as your fabric just about covers the shape with a tiny little overlap around the edge, that's really all you need. You don't need to have lots of excess fabric hanging around the outside of your shape. there we go. We've got our half rectangle triangles all cut out. So now I've cut out all of the pieces I need for my 5440 or Fight block. I can start to assemble that quilt block. So what I'm going to do is put my machine away for now and get all my pieces laid out. It's a really, really good idea when you're doing, particularly if you've never made a block before, to actually lay all the pieces out in front of you on the table, just to make sure that you've got everything in the right place. I would never, ever, cut out all of the pieces for a whole quilt before I'd ever made one block. I would make one block first of all. Now that's for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons is that I want to make sure that I like making this block. I want to make sure that I'm happy with the piecing, that my piecing is accurate, that I understand the order. I also want to check that, I like the colour arrangement. Maybe once you've made one block, particularly if you photograph it, you can look at that photograph and see maybe that red is not the right red. Maybe I need something a little brighter. If you've already cut the pieces out for your entire quilt, you've kind of committed. So really good idea just to make one block and check it and maybe live with it for a day or two as well. So I'm just laying out all the pieces now for my checkerboard corners. And then last of all, I've got my triangle in a square centre that I'm going to lay in the centre right here. And this is the classic 5440 or Fight quilt block, and this is the centre that we're going to start with. Right, so we're ready to start piecing our 5440 or Fight block. We're going to start with something really simple, which is just piecing the 4-patch which forms the corners of the block. 2 red and 2 cream squares. Now we can chain piece this, and what I mean by chain piecing is take your first 2 patches, 1 red and 1 cream. We'll have the light one on top. Lay them together, right sides together, lift your presser foot on your sewing machine and lower it, and then using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew along that first side. Now, don't cut your thread, grab your next pair of patches, but this time, because we're making 4 patches with red and cream on opposite sides, we're actually going to put the next pair through with the red fabric on top. So first time it was cream fabric on top, second time it's red fabric on top. So lift your presser foot, put your patch underneath and sew again. Now we're just going to keep going like this. So cream on top, red on top, cream on top, red on top. You get the picture, right? And we'll sew all 16 squares together. So red on top next. And what this is doing is creating a chain. Now this is fantastic because it speeds the process up, it makes us more time efficient, but also it really, really helps to minimize thread wastage. And I know that thread wastage is maybe not a massive deal, but for me, having to stop sewing to wind a bobbin is a big deal. I don't like winding bobbins. There, I've said it. If I can do anything to minimize that, and I don't want to waste thread for the sake of it, there's nothing worse than running out of thread before you've finished a project. So we're on to our last 2 pairs of squares, and this is going to create one long chain. Last pair, red on top, squares together and stitch. Okay, so there we go. I've made bunting. Now we don't want bunting, so I'm going to cut these pieces apart. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut them apart in pairs. Okay, so I was very particular about one red on the top, one cream on the top, and that was for a special reason which you will see now. So what I'm going to do is open up my first pair of joined squares. I'm going to use my fingernail just to push the seam allowance towards the red square. Okay, so I've opened them out. You can see the 4 patch that they're going to be, and look, they're joined in the center with that little bit of thread. That's going to act almost like a pin to hold the center together. So now I'm just going to flip those 2 patches right sides together, back under the machine, and sew. My seam allowances are pushed in opposite directions. So that's my first 4 patch all done. And although I have my iron at the ready, I really only use that when my units are completely sewn together. So once I've sewn them all together, I'll be able to give them a quick press before I move on to my next stage. But you can see how quick and efficient it is to do your piecing in this way. It really does make a difference, and particularly if you've got a lot of these blocks to make. So there we go, this is number 3. Just make sure that you push your seam allowances in opposite directions. I'm using red thread for my piecing. I'm using red thread because at home I want you to be able to see my seam lines. But normally if I'm piecing my quilts, I like to use something like a neutral mid-toned grey, or maybe a buff colour, something dull and drab. I always say, you know, the kind of colour that you wouldn't dream of wearing. Something like that, something shadowy and a bit grim. Okay. So that's my last seam sewn. And then I can just clip those patches apart and cut off the final thread. And what you'll see now I've got is 4 patches all sewn together, and they just need a quick press. I've got my iron and ironing board here, so I can just push that seam open and give it a press and then lay it back. This is why I really like to have my block laid out in front of me, and that way as soon as I've finished making my patches, I can put them straight back down where they belong. Hopefully this helps me avoid that oopsie block where you manage to twist a block or twist a unit and put it in the wrong place. We've all done it, but I hate unpicking, so if I can avoid doing that, I will. Great, so I've got all of my 4 patch units made. That was quick and easy. The next thing that I'm going to do is create my triangle in a square unit. And that's using dies 13 and 14, and that's this section right here. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to chain piece this unit as well, because again, that's the most time efficient way of doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all of my triangle in a square units and lay them on top of each other, all facing up the same way, right next to me at the sewing machine. Okay. So I've got a right-handed half rectangle triangle and a left-sided half rectangle triangle. And what I'm going to do, it doesn't matter where you start, but we're just going to do all of the right or all of the left first of all. So we're going to grab our first 2 patches. Now what I want to be able to show you is when I lay the half rectangle triangle on top of the center, because the dog ears have been clipped off, the patches match perfectly at top and bottom. If you'd rotary cut these shapes or used a template and hadn't cut the dog ears off, the ends would be hanging over somewhere vaguely in the ether, and it's really difficult to get an accurate block. But because the dog ears are cut off, matching up your points is so easy and straightforward. It's easy enough for a brand new quilter to do. Just take it slow and steady, that's all you've got to do. Now you can see here I'm flying by the seat of my pants and not pinning. You could pin this, and I'm just going to start sewing. Now, did you see that little trick I used there? When you're sewing patches, particularly when you're sewing on the diagonal, it's very easy for the first part of your patch to get gobbled up by your machine. What I do is I hold on to the top and bobbin threads, and as I'm taking the first couple of stitches on my first patch, I pull gently back on those threads to sort of draw my patches into through the machine, okay? And it really helps me to avoid ever having that fabric gobbling nightmare. So I'm just going to keep on sewing now, making sure that everything is staying lined up, and I'm going to sew that 1/4 inch seam right to the end. Grab your next set of patches, again using the right-sided triangle, half rectangle triangle, lay it on top and carry on sewing. And again, just make sure that you're keeping the edges of the fabric lined up perfectly. You know, just take a few stitches at a time and adjust if you need to. 2 to go. So again, just line up that half rectangle triangle with the side of the triangle in a square. And make sure as well, when you're lining up your patches, it's very tempting just to line up the top of the patch, but make sure that you line up the bottom of the patch as well and keep it in place, and that way you will avoid going sort of skew whiff halfway through. So keep sewing, and then we'll just lay that one on top. Now this is a much more efficient way of sewing these patches than trying to sew one side and then breaking your threads and trying to sew on the other side, because we actually need to iron these patches before we can add the next side. And if you're constantly stopping and taking your patches out of your machine, it really can slow you down. So look, we've made more bunting. This one's triangular. So I'm going to clip my threads and I'm going to cut my patches apart, and then I can finger press. So again, I'm going to press towards that darker fabric, which in this instance is the blue star center. So I just like to use my fingernail to push that fabric away from the center triangle. Be gentle with this. You don't want to stretch the fabric, but you just want to push it in the right direction. Fabric, like elephants, has a very long memory, and once you crease fabric, you sort of tell the fabric which way you want it to go. Pre-creasing your fabric using your fingernail is a great way to make sure that when you go to your iron and press, everything just goes in the right direction, and you get a lovely, flat, accurate, even finish. And that's what patchwork's all about. AccuQuilt's doing the accurate cutting for you. You've just got to make sure that everything else is done accurately. So now we've got the first side of our half rectangle triangle for our triangle in a square, and it's all pressed back. So now we're going to chain piece and add the remaining side. So again, you're just going to flip that patch on top. Now when I added the first side, I started from the wide end and went down to the narrow. When I do the other side, I'm going to start at the other end and sew up to the point. So again, line up your edges, make sure everything's matched up neatly, and sew. Grab your next patch, lay it on top, and again, sew. There are so many quilt blocks that you can use your angles companion for. Things like 5440 or Fight, of course, but also for creating things like Storm at Sea, which is a fantastic quilt block and very popular one, but again has those half rectangle triangles which so many of us avoid cutting out. Not anymore. Okay, last one. So we'll just lay those patches on top and sew. Fab. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is clip the first thread, cut my patches apart, and then I'll finger press them and then press them for real. This is such easy accuracy. And this is the kind of quilt and quilt block that gets lots of oohs and ahs at Quilt Guild, because we all know how difficult these patches are to cut, because we all avoid doing them because we can't do them with our rotary cutter. But now you know the secret and how easy it is with AccuQuilt. You can add these patches and these shapes to your quilts, and it's up to you if you tell people how easy it was. I won't tell. So there's number 3. And then last of all, number 4. Okay, so our patches are all pieced together. I've laid out my units in the right order, and again this is time for me to take a visual check just to make sure that every patch is in the right way. It would be so easy and would create a lovely block, but it's not the block I want. But to turn all of those units around and create a different sort of block. This is where you can have a little bit of an experiment with your patches. But a word of caution, don't play with your blocks too much, or be gentle with them, because you don't want to stretch the edges, otherwise you can start getting some inaccuracies. Okay, so once you're happy that everything is in the right position, it really is as simple as sewing together a 9 patch, just a simple 9 patch. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at the top and we're going to work on the first 2 units. Okay, so we've got a 4 patch unit and a triangle in a square. I love, it never ceases to please me when I put 2 different patched units together and they are the same size. Having quilted for many, many years and cut inaccurately with templates and rotary cutters and tried to put different units together and they don't fit, they're different sizes, and it's so frustrating. And in my experience, that's when something becomes a UFO, because the pieces don't go together. Now when you're piecing the triangle in a square unit with the centre patch, I like to sew with the triangle unit on top. Now the reason why I do that is because I can see where my 2 seams meet and the top point of my triangle in a square is when I'm sewing. And if I make sure that my seam line just kisses that sort of cross where those 2 seam lines meet, I'll get a perfect point. So again, I'm chain piecing, putting my block together. This is about as time efficient as it's possible to be. Let's do our last one now. And I always flip right on top of left. You get into these habits, generally speaking, you don't go wrong. Now I'm not going to cut my threads, but what I am going to do here is I'm going to push my seam allowances out. So the bottom row I'm going to push out towards the 4 patch. My middle row I'm going to push in towards my centre square, and then my top row I'm going to push out to meet the 4 patch. So I'm alternating the direction that my seams go. So these pieces are still joined together, which is going to help me greatly. Okay, so now I'm going to flip my next patch, my 4 patch, on top and take it to my sewing machine. And sew my first seam. Now I've got my next one, which is my centre square, and I've got my triangle in a square unit, which I'm just going to line up. and then sew that one. And then last of all, I've got my triangle in a square unit and my 4 patch. And again, let's just make sure that that unit's going in the right way. Line those 2 patches up. And sew. Just make sure that the ends match up neatly. Okay, great. So now I can clip my threads and now open everything up. Hurrah, it looks like it's supposed to. Now I'm going to do the same again with my finger pressing. I'm going to push the seam allowances out towards the 4 patches and in towards the center square. And that way my seam allowances will alternate when I sew the block together. And look, it's all kind of held together by those little bits of thread where I chain pieced. And this means that now all I have to do is flip the 3 units at the side over. Isn't this great? Sewing without pins. You can pin it if you want to, of course. I'm just showing you some of the tips and tricks that I employ as a professional quilter to speed up and streamline the process of making blocks, and particularly if you've got a lot of these blocks to make, all of these little tips and tricks really help. Just making sure that my unit intersections match up nice and neatly. Make sure that your seam allowances lay flat and are all matching up. My fingers are acting as pins, they're doing the job. Clip my threads, lovely, and then just flip it around and do the same on the other side. So again, just matching up the top of my seam. I always hold on to my top and bobbin thread as I take those first stitches to save my machine from gobbling up the fabric, but also just to make sure that I don't get that kind of snatch back of the thread as the machine takes the first stitch and unthreads itself. So last little bit of this seam. Clip your threads. And there's our block, 5440 or Fight. All this needs is a quick press. So what I'm going to do is bring my pressing board around and give this a good press. Now it's not a bad idea when you're doing your patchwork to set your seams. And what I mean by that is just leave your patches with right sides together and just kind of drop your iron on top. Don't drop it, but you know, kind of place your iron on top and let it just sort of warm up the seams. Once that's done, you can then flip that section back and then press the seam. You get a much flatter seam if you set it first of all. Okay, so we've done that side. Now we'll do exactly the same on the other. So make sure that all our seams are where they're supposed to be. Nothing twisted, everything nice and flat. And warm it up and then just press that seam back away from yourself. And where you've got things like the triangle in a square unit, you know, you can get there in there with your nail and just finger press just to make sure that that's pushed down really firmly. There's nothing wrong with using a little bit of steam when you're pressing your patchwork blocks as well. Just make sure that you're quite gentle when you're pressing your block with steam. You don't want to start stretching it out of shape. And there we go. There is our classic 5440 or Fight quilt block. Now, I've done a bit of an adaptation for the quilt project this month. So I'm going to show you how I take the block just that little bit further, for which I'm going to need a couple more dies out from my cube. Okay, and I'm going to need to grab my machine back out. So you can see on the quilt that what we've got are these sort of kite shapes almost here, and these are created with flying geese units, rectangles and squares. So that's what I'm going to cut out next. I've got my quarter square triangle die, that's die number 4 from your cube. I've also got die number 5, which is half square triangles. And then I've got die number 8, which is rectangles. And again, it doesn't matter which size cube you're using, you can still make this block, you can still make this quilt, but it will just be a different size. Now, those of you who are eagle-eyed will have noticed that this block does not look 10 inches, and you're absolutely right, it isn't. The 54, 40 or fight quilt block using your cube will be 1.5 times the size of your cube. So for example, if you've got a 6-inch cube and you make this block, your block will be 9 inches as is. By the time you've added on your extra elements, which we're going to do now, it'll be double the size of your cube, so it'll be a 12-inch block. Using my 10-inch cube to make this, my 54, 40 or fight block is 15 inches, and then once I've added my piece borders, it will be 20 inches. So, you know, I've said it many, many times, don't think that because you've got the 8-inch cube, you can only make 8-inch blocks. The world really is your oyster. Okay, so let's grab, first of all, the quarter square triangle block. And we're going to need to cut just 4 quarter square triangles. And we need to cut them out in the same cream or tan that you used for the triangle in a square centre, okay? Because we want them to match up in this particular quilt. Now it might be in another quilt pattern that you actually want a different effect. So you could play around with using different fabrics for that. But for this actual quilt block, we want to sort of extend that shape. So there are my flying geese all cut out, and I've got 4 of them. And then I'm also going to grab my small half square triangle, and I'm going to use, now I've bordered my quilt in blue. I've used the same colour as the star, so that's the colour that I want. And for this unit, I need 8 of these, which means that I need 4 layers. So I've got a couple of scraps, actually I might just use that one. Just make sure that I've got enough to cover my shapes. Not to waste any fabric. Okay, that's fine, and we'll cut those. Okay, super. So I've got my quarter square triangle and my small half square triangles to make my flying geese. So I'm just going to put those units there at the ready. Now then, I also right at the start used my small square, square number 2. I'm going to need 4 of those. So again, let's just see if we can use up a little scrap here. There we go, that one and that one. So we'll cut out 4 squares. And that's going to be for the outer corners of the block. And then last of all, I need some rectangles. That's using die number 8. And you're going to need 8 rectangles. Now, on most of the cubes, the rectangle cuts out 2 at a time. So I need 4 layers of fabric. So let's put 4 layers of fabric over the top of that shape and cut. There we go. So that's my 8 rectangles all cut out. And get rid of my machine now and lay my pieces out. So I'm starting with my centre quilt block, and my flying geese unit is going to sit right here. Okay, like that. And once I put that down into place, I can see that large kite shape very clearly. I'm also then going to put a rectangle either side of that, which creates the border. And then last of all, in the corners, I'm going to have a little square. And that will finish off that border. Now I'm not going to lay all of that out because I want to get straight to my piecing. So the first bit of piecing that I'm going to do is my flying geese. And again, I can chain piece these. Just have them in by the side of your sewing machine. Piece one side of the flying goose first of all. Because you've cut your shapes on the bias, the edges that you're sewing at the moment are bias edges, you need to be really careful not to stretch your fabrics. So as they're going through your sewing machine, try not to pull or push, just let your sewing machine do the job of carrying your fabric through. Another little tip to help handling bias edges easier is before you cut your fabric, just use some ordinary spray starch and lightly spray your fabrics and iron them. Sometimes it's known as sizing in fabric. And if you're a pre-washer, if you like to pre-wash your fabric, you tend to remove any stiffness from the fabric, which is lovely to handle, but it can mean that the fabric stretches more. So if you've done that, or your fabric sort of feels a little bit floppy, it's really not a bad idea just to pre-starch your fabric. But do it before you cut the fabric out. Okay, it doesn't make the cutting any different, it'll be just as easy and successful, but it will mean that the bias edges are just a little bit more well behaved, which we like. So I'm just finger pressing that corner back on the flying goose. There's number 3 and number 4, and then very quickly I can just go to the iron and I'll iron those back so they're nice and flat. Having everything as flat as possible before you add the next piece just means that you'll be much more accurate when you put everything together. So that's one side. Now we can go to the other side and add that remaining corner to the flying geese. So again, hold on to your thread as you take the first couple of stitches, and then your machine won't gobble up the fabric. Okay, there we go. That's the first one. Adding this border really sort of helps to create a look of where does the block begin and end, or what is the block. It's a great way of adding a different dimension. The pattern that we've actually published for you to use uses 4 of these quilt blocks with an outer border, but you could just make one and make a small wall hanging as I have, or a cushion. You could put 3 or 5 in a row and make a great table runner or bed runner. But making one block on its own is a really, really fantastic way of trying out a new technique, seeing if you like the pattern, expanding the possibilities, opening your eyes to what you can do with the tools that you have. So again, I'm just cutting my flying geese apart, and then again I can go to my ironing board. I'll just set that seam and press it back. I like my iron on a cotton setting when I'm using cotton fabrics, so I have it on its highest setting. It's always worth checking with your fabrics, make sure that you're not going to spoil your fabric. There we go. Great. Perfect. All right then, so now I'm going to assemble the quilt block. I'm going to lay these all out where they belong. Again, this really helps when you're putting together your block. It stops you getting confused about what goes where. And sometimes as well, if you haven't cut out all the pieces that you're supposed to, you'll spot it now. Because it's quite frustrating when you're sewing to think, why don't I have enough pieces? Okay, last two rectangles in place. Okay, brilliant. Now then, the first thing that I need to do is to sew a rectangle either side of the flying goose. So I'm going to sew those 3 units together, and again I can chain piece to speed up the construction. So here we go, let's sew a rectangle onto the side. When you're doing a border like this, which is supposed to look like one fabric but is actually made up of multiple patches, it's a really good idea to pick a fabric that has quite a busy all over design and something that isn't linear. I've used a little small scale floral fabric from Tilda, and it's perfect because you can barely see where the seam lines are. So when you look at the quilt block, it reads as one whole piece of fabric. So that's done already. I've sewn those 4 rectangles on, and now I don't even need to cut them apart. I'm just going to keep them in a chain and add the rectangle to the other side of the flying goose unit. So the flying goose will be on top this time. Make sure everything stays lined up nicely. There we go. And so. So again, we're going to add a rectangle to each one. So lay my rectangle down on the sewing machine, flying goose unit on top, and run it through the machine. That's number 2. Let's grab number 3. If this all seems a bit confusing, you can do these units one at a time. And you know, it's not a bad idea to do that for the first time you ever make a quilt block. Slow and steady wins the race, and I would never recommend trying to chain piece a whole quilt if you haven't had a go at making one block on its own, because you know what, that's when you're going to get one of your units upside down, and you're not just going to do it once, you're going to do it 49 times. Okay, that's done. So now what we can do is cut those units apart. There we go, and there as well. Fantastic. And last thing of all is on 2 of those units, I need to add a square at either end. Just square number 2. Okay. And that's going to create the top and bottom border. Again, we can chain piece, grab another, add a square, and run it through. Oops, clip those apart. And add your square to the other side. And grab the last one and add a square. Now before you add these borders, you do want to give them a press. So I'm just pressing all of my seams now on my border pieces. I'm going to lay them out. There's the long one for the top. Here's the long one that's going to go on the bottom. And then we've got our 2 sides as well. and these are shorter. And these are the ones that we're going to sew on first. There we go. Okay, so we'll sew those two sides on. So right sides together. And again, you could pin your seam intersections if you want to. I'm going to hold mine where they need to be and keep my fingers crossed. Okay, that looked pretty good. And keep sewing across. Last little bit. Make sure the ends match up. Okay. And then we're going to add a border to the other side as well. Again, remember this is the short border. Make sure that you've got this strip the right way round so that the wide bottom of your flying goose is meeting with your triangle in a square unit. And again, sew straight across. Keep everything matched up nice and neatly. And match up the ends. Okay. Perfect. Now press those borders back out of the way. So start by just setting your seam and then pressing them back. And you'll see straight away once I press those back that the joining together of the triangle in a square unit and the flying goose creates that big kite shape, which I think is really fun and would be great fun to quilt as well. You could do a lovely motif, maybe like a swirl or a spiral motif in there, or feathers. It's great to have these spaces where several different fabrics join up to create one larger shape. So once you've got those borders pressed back, you can add your top and bottom borders, which are the longer sides. And what's great about including, if you like, a sashing on a block is once you finish doing that, your block is done. It's all sashed, it's all ready to go. So for my small wall hanging, I literally then quilted and bound it and it was finished. But you could put 4 blocks together for a wall quilt. You could put 6 or 9 blocks, maybe 9 blocks would be good, 16 blocks together to make a fantastic throw quilt. Or you could create a large quilt just by making more blocks. And you could even add more piece sashing in between. There's loads and loads of possibilities with this quilt block. So let's just sew this last seam. There we go. That's one border put on. And the last one. Right sides together. Get everything lined up. And sew. Great. Now then, I'm just going to make sure that there are no loose threads hanging off the back of my work. So quick haircut at the end. Excellent. And then I'm going to press those final seams. So set them first of all using your iron, and then push them back and press them good and flat. And again, this is a time where if you've got seams which are a little bit thicker, or you've got lots of seams meeting up, a little blast of steam there can really help to make everything lie nice and flat. Okay, last seam. And then press everything back. And we are done. So there it is, my modified 5440 or Fight block, complete with pieced border. Double the size of your cube, so 6-inch cube makes an 12-inch block, 8-inch cube makes a 16-inch block, 9-inch cube makes an 18-inch. This is the 10-inch cube, which makes a 20-inch block. And if you've got the 12-inch cube, this finished unit would end up at 24 inches square. So 4 of those together and you've got a 48-inch square quilt. 4 blocks to make a fantastic wall quilt. And it's just that little bit different because you've used your AccuQuilt Angles Companion. Now don't forget, with AccuQuilt, better cuts make better quilts. Make sure you subscribe and join me for every quilting classroom brought to you by Create and Craft TV and AccuQuilt. See you next time.